All right. Um, what's the most ridiculous thing that you've ever been told to do? You ever been asked to do something incredibly ridiculous? A couple years ago, I got these hot sauces as a package for my brother-in-law, and they're pretty hot. One's called Fire Alarm Hot Sauce. It says "Don't do it" on it. Okay. 911 hot sauce, and then we have the tiny one is the hottest sauce in the universe, which I think the ingredients are like ghost peppers and ghost peppers. Y'all know what I'm talking about, right? And so I don't really recall what happened, probably because I had some of this and blacked out, but I believe that we dared each other to eat some of that hot sauce as a way to celebrate Christmas, as you do, right? Years before that, I was living in Columbia, Missouri, and I stayed the summer after my freshman year to work, and I got a job framing houses. And one day, we were up framing this office building, actually, so I'm 3 stories up, and I'm on the roof. And my boss is this hard-driving man, Joe. We worked 12-hour days, sometimes 13, 14 hours. Joe was always trying to get me to work on Saturday and even Sunday. And so this was a tough job, but I was young and kind of machismo and all that, so I was down for it. And so I'm up on this roof, and I'm carrying these pieces of plywood. They're 4 foot by 8 foot. You carry it like this, and you're walking on a slanted roof, and you lay them down, and the other guys are tacking it down. But I'm the new guy, right? So like I'm doing all the carrying, they're doing all the hammering, because I don't know how to hammer, apparently. And I'm carrying these, and you know how a storm comes in, you can see the dark clouds, and then there's like little bits of raindrops at first, and the wind starts to pick up. That starts happening. And the decking starts to get a little slippery. And that plywood starts to function like a sail, catching the wind. And I'm still working because you just don't stop working when you work for Joe. And at some point, though, I'm getting really concerned because we're 3 stories up. And I yell down to Joe and I say, "Hey, man, there's a storm coming. Should we come down?" And he says, "No, keep working." And so I keep working until this gust of wind catches one of the pieces of plywood, drags me to the edge of the building. I let go of the plywood. It falls 3 stories, crash, bang, and I'm on the edge of this roof. $8 an hour, by the way. And I'm like, see my life flash before my eyes. And at that moment, I didn't care anymore. I didn't care what Joe said. I got off the roof. He could fire me. I've seen him fire people on the spot. I didn't care. I walked right past him. I don't really recall much of what happened after that because I took a stand and I was done. And sometime later, I actually left that job. So we're in the 3rd week of the book of Daniel. And today you're going to hear a story about something ridiculous that King Nebuchadnezzar asked Daniel to do. And then we're going to hear a second story about the boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, taking a stand. All right. Before we do that, I want to do just a quick review of where we've been. So in week 1, we talked about the setting of the authors, because every story that's ever been told has a setting of the people that tell it. And the book of Daniel was written by real people in a real place and time, and the events of what was going on influenced the book of Daniel. And so what was going on is that in 168 BC, there was a violent occupation by this guy, Antiochus IV. He was one of the descendants, so to speak, of Alexander the Great. He came down through that line, and he had made the Jewish religion illegal and did all sorts of horrible things to them. There's a group called the Maccabees, which were Jewish revolutionaries who rose up and ended up taking back the temple and actually having a period of independent Jewish rule in the Holy Land for the first time in over 400 years. And Daniel gets written, I believe, out of this context. Scholars debate it, but I find this incredibly persuasive. And the people are in between a rock and a hard place because Antiochus, he's brutal, but the Maccabees, even though they're Jewish revolutionaries, if you don't join them, well, they would force you or kill you. At least that's the account of First Maccabees that tells the story. In week 2, we talked about the setting of the story. Okay, so that's the setting of the author, but then there's the setting of the story. And Daniel's fascinating because it's written in one period of time, but the story actually takes place in an earlier time. It takes place in 606 and the years after, when the Babylonians came in and forced a group of people, the best and the brightest, to live in exile, in captivity. Daniel and the boys, they're prisoners of war. And then last week we began to talk about the third way response. The book of Daniel is written to show us this third way response. What's the third way? Well, it is the third way that is different than our naturally ingrained fight and flight response. Okay, in every one of us, there's an emotional and even like a biological response to conflict that we either run away or we fight. And Daniel is showing us this different way that Jesus would later live and bring to fulfillment. The third way, a way to be faithful without running, and a way to stand up to evil without becoming evil. So that's the summary. It's all online if you want to go back and watch it. Today, one last point that is important. Why is Daniel written in this way? It's because of this. A story of faithfulness in the past can empower faithfulness in the present. And the people that wrote the book of Daniel and brought it together in the mid-2nd century, they were facing really, really difficult circumstances. And so the authors did something brilliant. They went back to a time that everybody would have known about, and they tell the story of faithfulness. And in your life, you can look back at your own personal story or a story from somebody else from the past as a way to build up your faithfulness in the present. God was faithful before, he can be faithful now. And this is really important because when you're in something difficult, it almost seems like it's the end-all, be-all, right? That there's no way out. You can't see a way out, you don't think there's a way out, and so it's really helpful and powerful to think about a time when you felt similar, but there was a way out. There was a faithful response. So here we are. Okay. Into the story. We're going to be in the 2nd chapter. Daniel's 12 chapters long. We're going to have to speed it up in the next week after that. But we're in 2nd chapter today. We'll get into the 3rd. And the 2nd chapter begins like this. Nebuchadnezzar, who's the king of Babylon, had dreams, and his mind was troubled, and he could not sleep. Have you ever had a bad dream that woke you up? And those dreams can be kind of crazy. Nebuchadnezzar's is crazy. We'll get to that in a minute. But here's what Nebuchadnezzar does when he has a bad dream. He summons the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, the astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, "I've had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means." Pretty reasonable, right? The astrologers answered the king, "May the king live forever." A little side note, if you ever approach a king, start that way. That's really wise. "May the king live forever. Tell your servants the dream and we will interpret it." All pretty reasonable. The king replied to the astrologers, "This is what I firmly decided. If you do not tell me what the dream was and interpret it, so I want you to guess what the dream was and then interpret it, y'all following? Then I will have you cut into pieces and your house turned into piles of rubble." This is life in Babylon, living underneath the sociopath, King Nebuchadnezzar, who cuts people into pieces and destroys their homes if they don't do the ridiculous things he wants them to do. And the dialogue goes on and on for a little while. The astrologers, they try to avoid it. And they're like, "Hey, well, then just tell us the dream." And the king gets more and more angry. And finally, he gets so angry, he's like, "You know what? We're just going to kill all the wise men in Babylon and we'll start over." And Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the boys, by this point, they've become wise men in Babylon. They're working for the king. They have government jobs. And so when the king says, "We're going to kill all the wise men," word goes out, and Daniel hears about it, and he's like, we're in trouble. And he gathers together his friends. And he says to them, he pleads with them, or urges them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed. He's like, "Guys, we need to pray and ask for God's mercy." And right here reveals one of the key themes in the book of Daniel. That key theme is that despite how it seems, God indeed is still in control. And things are pretty bleak for Daniel and the boys at this point, but he says, let's pray. God's still in control. We're not finished yet. During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. which is great news, right? But here's the question. How does he know that that's the actual dream? How does he know that that's the actual vision? I mean, sometimes you get an insight from God. I mean, you might not think of it that way, but I believe that you do. You get a nudge, or you get an insight, or you get like this, I should go talk to that person or do that thing. And then you have this question of like, how do I know that this is legit? Because it's easy to be a little bit scared, right? Here's what Daniel does. This is pretty brilliant. He starts to pray. He says, praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes the times and the seasons. He deposes kings and raises up others. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep, hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells within him. What's he doing? He's confessing his convictions. And when we confess our convictions about who God is, it builds our confidence. And so if you believe God actually can provide a way forward, if you believe God actually does bring renewed life, and maybe you don't believe that yet, but the invitation is there. If you have these beliefs about God actually being in control, sometimes, especially in those difficult moments when it feels like God is not in control, you can take a page out of Daniel's playbook and confess those convictions. It will build your confidence. Daniel goes on in his prayer, I thank you and praise you, God of my ancestors. You have given me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what we asked of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king. Now, Daniel's doing something else quite brilliant in his prayer here. And that is he's claiming what God has done. And you have to claim what God has done in order to have it, right? The cookies can be on the table, but you can't enjoy them unless you pick them up. And so if you believe that God actually can make a difference, one way to build your confidence in that is actually confess that conviction, and then you have to claim it. And that's what Daniel's doing. I mean, it still lingers in the air. Does he have the right dream? It still lingers in the air. Is it going to be okay? But at least he's going to show up with conviction and confidence. And it changes everything. Daniel goes to the king Nebuchadnezzar. He says, no wise man can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. Your Majesty looked, and there before you stood a large statue. So now he's going to interpret the dream. An enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. And then he goes on to describe it. Like my graphic design? It's so good. Yeah. So the head is gold, and the arms are made out of silver. We got the belly and thighs made out of bronze, and the legs are made out of iron, and the feet is a mixture of iron and clay. You had a weird dream last night? This is a weird dream. And then there's this rock that distinctively was not cut out by human hands. If it's not cut out by human hands, whose hands would it be? Probably God, right? Okay? It's a dream. It points to something. And this rock, it comes and it hits the statue and it obliterates it. And then the rock grows into this mountain that fills the earth. Weird dream? Weird dream, right? So Daniel then begins to interpret it. First he says, Your Majesty, you are King of Kings, because you're talking to a king, and this is just a good way to talk to a king. You are the King of Kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. Now, who does Nebuchadnezzar get his dominion and might and power from? Come on now, it's in yellow. Let's say it together. The God of heaven, right? Because he's driving home this theme. Despite how it seems, God is still in control. Nebuchadnezzar seems to have absolute power in Babylon. But Daniel's very clear that behind that power is the real power. In your hands he has placed all mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds of the sky. You are the head of gold. So he's starting to interpret this weird dream. So here we go. The head is the Babylonian Empire, historical empire. All right? Going on, he says, after you, another kingdom will arise inferior to yours. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. And so these next two is the Medo-Persian Empire. It's actually two empires that have an alliance together. And then the Greeks, because Alexander the Great was said to have taken over the whole earth. Now I should stop and point out, if you were to go home and Google all of this, like I think you're probably going to do because you're so fascinated by Daniel's interpretation of the dream, you would discover that there's scholarly debate about who the empires are. So what I'm presenting to you is what I think is the most compelling and truthful to the text. But there's debate, okay? It's 2,000 years ago that this was written, more than 2,000 years ago. So going on, finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything, so it will crush and break the others. And I think that this is talking about Antiochus IV, who's smashing and breaking and destroying the temple and wreaking havoc on the Jewish people, right? Remember 168. This is the context in which the story comes out of. Going on, finally, he says, and just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united. Now, I'm sure some scholars actually take this position, but I haven't discovered any yet. But I think that this is referring to the Maccabees. If you read the story of the Maccabees, those are the revolutionaries that rise up against Antiochus. Their downfall is that they begin to fight against each other. They're not united. They're like iron and clay. And they become weak and get taken over by the Romans. My interpretation. All right? I know you're wondering, here's the point. And this is the point that all scholars agree on. What Daniel is interpreting here is that every human kingdom comes to an end. It seems like they last forever, but every human kingdom comes to an end. Rome ended, Alexander the Great's kingdom ended, the British Empire ended. America's dominance one day will end. Every kingdom, human kingdom, comes to an end. Now, I know what you're all thinking. You're wondering, what about the rock? Sorry, wrong rock. Okay. What about the rock? Okay, we got this interpretation now. Here's what the book of Daniel says about the rock. He says, in the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. Now, Christian writers throughout history have said, you know who this is? Jesus. This is Jesus, which I find pretty compelling. However, when I read this, I thought of something that Jesus said. And Jesus said this at one time. I tell you that you are Peter, which means rock. And on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will never overcome it. I believe that the rock that is never destroyed is the church that Jesus came to found. We'll talk about that a little bit at the end. And here's the point. Human kingdoms end, but God's kingdom lasts forever. And it's this conviction that allows Daniel and the boys to be able to stand up in the face of absolute difficulty. We've got to keep going. Daniel says, the great God, because God is really in control, great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true and its interpretation is trustworthy. And then Nebuchadnezzar falls prostrate before Daniel, paid him honor, and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. Now, this is truly messed up because Nebuchadnezzar, he's just not getting it. All along, Daniel's saying, you know where this comes from? This comes from God. Let me point you to God, the real power. But Nebuchadnezzar thinks he's a God-like figure, so it's only appropriate for him to be mistaken and worship Daniel. It's weird, but it's how the story goes. And then Daniel and the boys get a promotion, all right? And there's actually, believe it or not, there's video of the promotion. Yeah, you know that song? Moving on up to the east side. Hey, Harry, unplug the audio and plug it back in. We could hear that. Yeah. All right. Yeah, fun, huh? All right, well, let's keep going. All right, so chapter 3. Chapter 3 begins this way. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold. He makes a statue. Just had a dream about a statue. What does he think? Well, I should make one. Okay, so he makes a statue, 60 cubits high and 60 cubits wide, which is hilarious because this is a translation, but what is a cubit? But if you were to look in your Bibles, you would discover that the statue is essentially 90 feet high. Now, how tall is the ceiling in here? I mean, I don't know for real, right? Like, maybe that tall, right? It's huge. It's this huge statue, okay? This is Nebuchadnezzar. This guy is a sociopath. He's crazy. And he's like, let's make this giant statue of gold. Well, what do you do with the statue of gold? Well, he summoned the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the advisors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So he makes everybody show up to come worship his new statue. And then he gets a herald to announce to the people this. He says, as soon as you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipe, and all kinds of music, what I want you to do is fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Personal theory about all this? I think Nebuchadnezzar's embarrassed that he fell prostrate before Daniel, so now he has to make everybody in the kingdom fall prostrate before his statue. All right? Here we go. Graphic design is my strong suit. All right? So you got the band over there rocking, and everybody's bowed down. It's this whole scene, and then somebody points out that there's these three guys that are not bowing down. You know who those guys are? Yeah, let's say it together. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And the king's like, I can't believe you're not bowing down to my statue. And they reply, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. That's pretty bold. This is the guy that cuts people into pieces and destroys their house. They go on to say, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, because if you don't bow down, there's this big, huge furnace, which I guess you have if you're a king, and he throws people in it, all right? Even if we're thrown in the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, just be on notice, your majesty, we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. How do you think Nebuchadnezzar responds? Happy? He's in a rage, and he has them bound up with like the strongest soldiers he has, and he has the furnace heated up 7 times hotter than normal, and the soldiers throw the guys in, but because it's so hot, they die because they got close to the furnace. It's this whole scene. Ridiculous. And here's the thing about the guys. They're willing to give up nearly everything. They get Babylonian names, they learn the Babylonian language, read the literature, they get government jobs. They're willing to give up almost anything, but they won't give up their absolute loyalty. That's where they draw the line. So they go into the furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked, weren't there 3 men that were tied up and threw into the fire? And the guys are like, well, yeah, there was 3. Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound, unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. Looks like there's a 4th person in there. We learn from this powerful idea that God protects the boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, in the fire, not from the fire. And in our lives, if you're expecting God to protect you from the fire, you got the wrong story. But the promise is he will protect you in the fire, somehow will sustain you in the midst of it. And these guys are sustained. And they come out. And they're not even burnt. They don't even smell like smoke, and it's just amazing. And Nebuchadnezzar says they trusted in him and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own. And so therefore I decree that people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, what? Be cut into pieces and houses be turned into piles of rubble, for there is no other God. Because, this guy's a sociopath. And the guys, they get another promotion. Hopefully we got the audio now.
Well, we're moving on now to the east side.
So we haven't talked about it, but this is the third way. Because they take a stand. They don't try to defend themselves. They don't grab a bunch of swords and start slashing their way out of that predicament. But they don't run from it either. They're willing to give up almost everything. A lot of the stuff that we get stuck on, external appearances and methods and that sort of thing, but the one thing they won't give up is their absolute loyalty. They take a stand. There's a Jewish rabbi that comes about 150 years after the story was written, about 600 years after the storyline of the book of Daniel, and he takes a stand against the Roman Empire and the corrupt Jewish authorities and ends up on a cross. He doesn't fight back, but he doesn't back down. He practices something that scholars have called the third way, a nonviolent resistance that does not return evil for evil. And the church is the rock that never is destroyed because the church never bows down in absolute loyalty to human authority. The church at its best never bows down with absolute loyalty to human authority because we are loyal to one thing, the Creator in heaven. That makes the church incredibly resilient and dangerous to those who allow their power to get out of line. So I ask you, in light of all this, where do you draw the line? Because the health of your soul requires that somewhere you draw the line. And the real threat to us is that internal threat when we lose ourselves because we just put up with things that we know we shouldn't. Now, I'm going to speak about my politics for a moment. And if you have different politics than me, you are welcome in this place, and I believe that you have them for good reason. But I believe that our president has crossed my line on multiple occasions. The way that he talks about people, the language that he uses, I don't think he's fitting for a president or a school teacher or a babysitter with that kind of language and the way that he talks about people. And this is a serious matter. And I have good friends that are supporters of President Trump, and they're my friends. But I ask them, if you haven't drawn the line yet, when do you? What does he have to do? One of my friends who I talked to this about, he quickly moved the conversation to the economy. And the implication was if the economy is doing well, then we're okay with this. And it wasn't the right setting for that, but what essentially I felt that he was doing is that his loyalty was to the economy, that became the false god. As Christians, our loyalty is to Christ. And whether it's Obama or Trump or whoever the next president might be, there needs to be a line that we will not cross. Otherwise, the decency and the goodness in our society begins to crumble. So that question's to you. And it might be about politics, or maybe it's about a personal relationship, maybe it's about a thing at work, but it is required of all of us to have a line that we don't cross. We don't fight back and try to destroy people, but we don't run. We practice the third way of Jesus. And in this story, I believe it points to this. You will experience God's deliverance when you take a stand against human belligerence. And it's scary because Nebuchadnezzar threw him into the fire. And there'll probably be consequences for you if you take a stand. But the promise is that God will deliver you in the fire and that somehow you'll experience that deliverance. Let us pray. Oh Lord, many of us have encountered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as like a children's story. And boy, this is an adult story. And it presses upon us to be very real about what we can take a stand against and the things that we can go ahead and give up. God, I pray for everybody here that when they're put in that situation, that they would have the courage of the guys, of the boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to take a stand, but not to fight back and try to destroy and harm, and certainly not to run. For God, despite it seems, you are in control. So we can have the confidence that conviction lends to us. In Jesus' name.